Hi, Acadiana. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Welcome to your Tuesday edition of Let's Talk Tropics. We still have Tropical Storm Oscar that's hanging out near the Bahamas, very disorganized and very weak with winds at 40 miles per hour. Of course, Oscar, now on record as the smallest tropical system, beating out Marco from 2008. The wind field there was only about 6 or 7 miles away from the center, while Marco, which was the earlier record holder, I think the winds went out about 15 miles as it moved into Central America. So we're going to talk about Oscar, but we're also going to talk about maybe a brief quiet period, and then things will start to ramp up once again, it looks like, as we head into the early part of November, according to a lot of our tropical models. So we'll get into that coming up in just a little bit, but another fine day here in Acadiana. We do have a little bit more cloud cover that's out here this time around. Just some high, thin clouds that have started to roll in. Temperatures are hovering around 76 degrees and the dew point now at 55. So our feels like temperature is also at 76 degrees. Humidity 48% and our winds are currently out of the northeast at around 3 miles per hour. Again, another beautiful day, although we are in need of rain. We're starting to get into that moderate to severe drought status across a large part of Acadiana, and we'll get a new update on the drought update coming up on Thursday. So we will see probably some even drier conditions across much of Acadiana, as we haven't seen any measurable precipitation since September the 24th, and we only picked up a trace of rain on October the 1st. So far for the month, we just have a trace in the bucket. We've had a couple of months in history, though, where October received no rain. So this is not a record setter just yet, but it's kind of close. I guess it would be tied for second, as we've got 2 years that have had zero rainfall during the month of October. But big ridge of high pressure that's still over the eastern part of the country. We've got kind of a weak system here moving across the middle part of the country. That's kind of bypassing us to the north. And there's yet another weaker trough that's back here to the northwest that might affect us farther down the road, maybe going into the early part of the weekend. But as that front gets closer or perhaps passes through Acadiana, again, there's not going to be a lot of moisture for it to work with, so we're expecting the front to go through dry. We're really not expecting any big increases in humidity in the next couple of days, although if you may have noticed this morning, the temperatures and the dew points did get a little bit closer to each other. So even though it was chilly out there, it did feel a little bit more like that damp cold that happens during the wintertime months. We even had a little bit of patchy fog that was out there. So going into the wave heights there of the Gulf of Mexico, it's been a few rough days out there, but things are finally starting to calm down a bit. Winds are still out of the east. They're going to shift more to the southeast later on, but the seas have been running about 1 to 2 feet in the nearshore water. So a much calmer day for boaters, and for the farther out offshore waters where some of the oil platforms are, you're probably seeing about 3 to 4 foot seas out there. But it is a really pretty day. You've got some fair weather, high, thin cirrus clouds that are currently moving up here along the Gulf Coast. And then you've got fair weather cumulus clouds that are kind of drifting westward on that easterly flow across the Gulf of Mexico. So those cirrus clouds that are streaming west to east in the upper levels, you can see you've got that westerly flow, and then in the lower levels where you're seeing more of the cumulus clouds, things are going from east to west. So you got that easterly flow coming in. So upper levels and lower levels kind of rolling in opposite directions this time, and you can see that pretty clearly on the Gulf of Mexico satellite. Central America is relatively quiet. You got a little flare up of some thunderstorms that are off the west coast of Nicaragua and El Salvador. We'll watch that for the possibility of some development on the Pacific side, but doesn't look too likely right now. And the Western Caribbean is currently quiet. But farther down in the broadcast here, we're going to talk about the Western Caribbean going into the first few days of November. I've got at least one model that's going with a significant storm, and then the other models are kind of picking up on some lowering pressures in that area. So the Caribbean, at least for right now, is not out of the woods when it comes to hurricane season. Of course, we've still got Oscar there that's over the eastern Bahamas. It is very disorganized and it's being sheared apart. There's still a bit of an identity identifiable low-level circulation there over the southeastern Bahamas, but you can see more of the thunderstorm activity is continuing across parts of the Atlantic Ocean. You get that shear that comes in like that, so it's blowing the tops off those thunderstorms. So the low is actually right about there, but you see most of the action is off toward the east. So a lot of the thunderstorm activity is offset from the center of circulation. And we'll go into more of the particulars here on Oscar in just a minute, but the rest of the Atlantic really is looking relatively quiet. It looks like we've got a bit of a tropical wave maybe right about here, and maybe another one kind of working its way across the Atlantic Ocean. We'll watch both of those, but the models sure don't seem to be very interested in it. But again, models have not been performing too well here over the last couple of weeks. We left you on Friday, both Nadine and Oscar. Nadine was looking like it was going to get the name, but Oscar really didn't look like it. But again, talking about how small Oscar was when it was a hurricane, a lot of those satellite passes that they make over these tropical systems before they can send reconnaissance aircraft out there, well, the satellite imagery really wasn't showing any significant winds. But once the hurricane hunters went in there, we knew we actually had a hurricane, and a very small one. So it's good that we have the hurricane reconnaissance aircraft to go out there and get that additional data for us, and then we can identify these storms a little bit better. Unfortunately, it was close enough to home that the hurricane reconnaissance crews could scramble and get a flight out as it was kind of drifting north of Puerto Rico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. So this is the latest satellite imagery we've got on Oscar. And as you can see, that low pressure area is kind of spinning right about in here right now, but the thunderstorm activity is all over on this side of it. So it's going to go ahead and move through the Bahamas, and most of the inclement weather is going to start to pull out into the Gulf of Mexico here in just a little bit. And the forecast does take this off toward the northeast, and eventually we think it's going to get absorbed by a non-tropical low pressure area that's probably going to go ahead and fire up right there along a frontal boundary that is currently moving across the Atlantic seaboard at this point. So as it does, it's going to absorb what's left of Oscar, and then it'll probably become a stronger non-tropical low pressure area as it moves off toward the northeast. And that's the guidance on the hurricane models. For the most part, it is going to be moving there off toward the northeast. And as far as the intensity models, again, this could still be a non-tropical low pressure area that can still produce tropical storm force winds or higher. So even though we think it probably will be non-tropical within maybe 36 or 48 hours, that low, after it absorbs it, the low that's off the east coast with a frontal boundary that could kind of absorb what's left of Oscar, the two of those combined could still be a significant low pressure area rolling northeastward, and that would of course affect mainly shipping concerns, and possibly the island of Bermuda might have a chance of seeing some action from this. But the HWRF model again has it being absorbed by that low, so you do see it actually get a little bit stronger here over the next 3 days going into Friday. But by the time it reaches the North Atlantic and is grazing those Canadian provinces, it should be a non-tropical low pressure area. And you see that kind of a shift where the low is there in the middle of that run. It's kind of got a smooth move there from the Bahamas, and then you see that little jump. That's when it gets absorbed by that other low pressure area. And again, you could see some decent pressure drops, but it would be more of a cold core type of system moving near the Canadian Maritime sometime early this weekend. So let's go ahead and look at the GFS model. And you can see Oscar quickly making its way out of the region. But start to watch that southwestern Caribbean Sea, and you start to see a lot of moisture building, and you start to see a low pressure area developing as well. And it's pretty significant too, according to the GFS. And I will say that the GFS here has been very consistent now of trying to develop some kind of a tropical system here over the western part of the Caribbean in the first part of November. So this is going out 10 days. So 10 days from today is November the 1st, and you can see in these last few frames, you are starting to see that low pressure area develop and then start to lift up toward Jamaica and perhaps Cuba. And we're going to take a look at the extended models because remember, the GFS goes out to 16 days. I think I've got enough data here that goes out to about 14 days. So we're going to look at that coming up down the road. The Euro model Again, very similar, taking Oscar away, but not quite as robust on a low pressure developing here. But you will see the moisture continuing to build over the western part of the Caribbean, and maybe a bit of a low pressure area working its way across Central America. But at the same time, you notice there's a big trough up here to the north. So anything that would develop down here would probably shoot out to the northeast, just like what Oscar did. But we'll have to watch out. If it gets over in this particular area, well, then Florida might be in the crosshairs of that. And we have not seen a hurricane reach Louisiana's landfall during the month of November, but I was digging, and I'm going to talk about this later this week, of some of the more significant November tropical storms and hurricanes. But we actually had a hurricane that made landfall on November the 22nd in the Florida Panhandle, believe it or not, and that was Hurricane Kate back in 1985. And that comes right after Hurricane Juan hit the Louisiana coastline at the very end of October, on October the 29th. So as I usually say, we can kind of let our guard down as we go into November. This has been a really unusual season, so I wouldn't really let my guard down just quite yet here in the Acadiana area. Not saying that anything's coming, but the way this season has shaped up, it's really done some crazy things. And you always hear folks after a flood, oh, the water's never been this high, or after a hurricane, oh, we've never seen the winds this high, this far inland, and things like that. I don't want to be saying that here in Acadiana. Oh, we've never had a hurricane during the month of November and then all of a sudden have one. Again, not saying that one's going to happen, but this is probably not the year to let your guard down just quite yet. So as we look at the Canadian, again, Oscar moving away. And the Canadian also has a little bit of a low developing over here, but it kind of generally moves westward over into Central America, very similar to what the Euro model did. It didn't have anything significant moving into the middle part of the Caribbean or maybe taking a turn toward the northeast. And the Icon model takes Oscar away. This one doesn't go out as far as the other three models. This only goes out 7 days, but by the time you get to day 7, you're starting to see a little low pressure kind of emerge off of the Colombian coastline and maybe work its way over toward Nicaragua. And we have seen November hurricanes down in this particular area make landfall in Nicaragua. I think there was even one that made landfall in Costa Rica. But we've also seen some systems that have developed here and moving off toward the east-northeast. We had one called Lenny, a hurricane that was a pretty significant hurricane that developed over here near Nicaragua and then moved off toward the east. They called it wrong way Lenny because usually you have tropical systems that work the other way around. But during the month of November, those winds really start to change quite a bit. So you tend to get more action moving away from Central America and moving off toward the northeast as you get that higher wind shear and those bigger cold fronts coming off the North American continent. And speaking of that wind shear, right now there's a ton of it here across the Gulf of Mexico. So if anything wants to try to develop, it's going to have to do it over parts of the Caribbean Sea because that's where the lower wind shear is going to be. And this is also where the lower wind shear is forecast to be here over the next week or so. Water temperatures are still plenty warm over the Caribbean Sea, anywhere between 29 and 30, maybe up to 31 degrees Celsius. So you're in that 85 to 88 degree range. Still got some decent warm waters here across the Gulf of Mexico, but you're starting to notice here along the coast, those numbers are starting to cool down quite a bit. Now that doesn't mean if you get some kind of a hurricane or a tropical system out here that it can't maintain itself before making its way on shore. That cool water might weaken it a little bit, but those colder waters don't go too far offshore. So we'll still have to watch for anything that could possibly develop. And hopefully nothing's going to be moving into the Gulf of Mexico anytime soon. Fortunately for the Gulf too, the tropical cyclone heat potential has really dropped off, but it's still quite high over the western part of the Caribbean Sea. So development there, if you get low wind shear and you've got the warm waters and the high heat potential, if you get just the right kind of system to develop, you can get something pretty strong out there. And the global tropics hazard outlook still has some action there going into the end of the month from the Western Caribbean, going into the western part of the Atlantic, but then also week 3, which is now about week 2, because we're going to get an update on this one, and I'll be able to bring you the new version tomorrow, but it's still showing that there could be some potential for some development over the Caribbean, which of course if any tropical systems do develop, the most likely place during the early part of November would be right there anyway. So climatologically, this is the place where you would normally see tropical systems develop. So let's move ahead. Again, I wanted to take you beyond that 10-day forecast, and you can see the latest GFS has a fairly strong hurricane developing about October 31st, November 1st, and then taking this up through, it looks like November the 4th, or maybe the 5th. This actually goes out to the 5th now. As you see, it gets close to Jamaica, crosses Cuba and the Bahamas, but it's still a fairly strong hurricane. Now, the GFS model has had a tropical system trying to develop in this area now for a number of days, but some of them have it going this way, some of it have it going this way, some just kind of have it falling apart in the middle part of the Atlantic. Another one I saw going off in this particular direction. So, and even one kind of lifting northward in that particular direction over the last couple of days. So what we are seeing that's fairly common between model run to model run is they've got something happening in this particular area, but where it goes after that, you've got a whole bunch of different solutions. But remember, this is still beyond 10 days out. We could see some major changes, or we may even see this thing not developing at all between now and 10 days from now. So we're going to have to watch and see how this evolves and if it actually verifies farther down the road. But as I said, during the month of November, the most likely place that you're going to see development is here over the western part of the Caribbean, the western part of the Atlantic, or sometimes you get some lows that track across the middle part of the Atlantic. And a lot of times those are associated with cold fronts that kind of whip up and pull those away from the region. But this area right here is probably the place where you're going to get the most likely tropical type of development during the month of November. And just looking at the progress of a season, we've already hit our 15th named storm, so we are now above normal on the hurricane season. Normally we get at least one named system by November the 19th. Sometimes we get another hurricane during the month of November, and usually you don't get major hurricanes, although it has happened during the month of November. But we've already had a number of major hurricanes. We're above normal on the major hurricanes so far for the 2024 season. So there is still 5 weeks left in the hurricane season, and I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see one, perhaps two more named storms before the season is over, and there's a possibility, according to some of our models, that we could be seeing another hurricane develop before the season is over. But that would also fall right in with our normal seasons of climate, where we usually get at least a named storm or a hurricane during the month of November. So not quite time to let your guard down just yet. Hopefully you still have the supplies that you got from Francine, and hopefully we won't need any of those things, as usually most of these tropical systems do bypass Acadiana off to the east. Well, that's what I've got for you today. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and also turn on those notifications. And I don't know if you were listening to Big 102 or Planet Radio this morning. I was on both of those stations talking about the upcoming partnerships that I have with these three great radio stations, where my weather forecasts will be presented during the morning drive, the midday shows, as well as the afternoon drive. So if you want to hear your local forecast through the radio stations, pick one of these three, and they've got you covered. And also, between any broadcast here on YouTube or on the radio, you can follow my social media pages, both on Facebook and X. Thanks everybody for joining me on this Tuesday afternoon. I hope you have a great day. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker, and I will see you on Wednesday morning for Acadiana Weather Today at 7:30.